I'm Saladin Ambar. Welcome to This Moment in Democracy. Today, I'm speaking with former New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman about Forward, a new political party and movement. Christine Todd Whitman is the co-founder and co-chair of the States United Democracy Center and the former governor of New Jersey. After her 2 terms as New Jersey's first female governor, she served in the cabinet of President George W. Bush as administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Governor Whitman is the co-chair of the Meridian Institute Board and chairman of the American Security Project. Previously, she served as co-chair of the Commission on the Rule of Law and Democracy at the Brennan Center at New York University. Additionally, she is vice chairman of the Eisenhower Fellowships Board of Trustees and co-chair of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. She is the author of the New York Times bestseller, It's My Party Too. Greetings, Governor Whitman. It's really terrific to have you here with us.
No, it's my pleasure. Delighted to be with you.
Well, I want to jump to that first line of your bio, if you don't mind. Could you just tell us a bit about your role as the co-chair of the States United Democracy Center? I'm not sure many listeners know much about it.
Certainly. Well, we started right after the 2020 election as Protect the Vote. And my 2 co-chairs are lawyers, both of them, and actually most of the organization is made up of lawyers. I'm one of the few of the outsiders, as it were. And our focus was on protecting and giving the states and the states' attorneys generals, the governors, and the secretaries of states the tools they needed to push back against all these people who were threatening to overthrow the election. We were able to see things from the national perspective, see what was coming, and be able to give them a heads up on the kind of tactics that the people who were trying to overthrow the election deniers, were going to be using. We worked with them, and we also filed a number of lawsuits against people like John Eastman to hold them accountable for the kinds of things they were saying and doing. So I think I've been amicus on more briefs as in this role than I was even as governor, with all the times I was being sued. But in any event, it is now something where we are, again, it's nonpartisan, it has nothing to do with partisanship. It has to do with protecting our democracy and the rule of law. And we are, again, working very closely with secretaries of state, states attorney general, and governors to help them push back against some of the things we're seeing to try to make it more difficult for people to access the polls. We're actually working with police across the country to tell them what the regulations are, what they can do, and what the restraints should be legally on poll watchers and observers in the various states. We have a deep bench, and interestingly enough, there are a lot of secretaries of states and attorneys general that don't have the depth that we have. And we have a number of law firms that are doing pro bono work for us. So we're able to provide a lot of help to the states. We've been very active in Pennsylvania in pushing back against some of these laws that are being passed and some of the efforts to turn over the ability of the local leaders to oversee the polls. We're also we have put up some educational material to help the public understand just exactly how important secretaries of states, states attorneys general, and governors are in the electoral process, and reminding them, if you have a candidate who's an election denier, you're basically putting Fox in charge of the henhouse, because you're putting in place where they can oversee the elections, determine how they are carried out, determine how the votes are counted, in charge of an election when they clearly don't believe it. If they're election deniers, and these are the election deniers we're talking about, actually 50% of Americans live in states where you have an election denier running for at least one of those offices. That means somebody who is going to be in a position to influence how elections are held in that state is still fighting the 2020 election.
Well, Governor, I was going to ask you to get into some of those nuts and bolts of how you are involved in doing this, and what that, not only the strategy, but what efforts were being made in the states. It sounds like there are quite a few. Can you share what kind of reaction or response you've been getting from some of these states? You mentioned about half of them have election deniers, very much influential in the process. What kind of reaction or responses have you been getting from governors, local officials, law enforcement to your efforts?
Actually, they've been welcoming us. They feel overwhelmed by this, a lot of them, and they have been very happy to have the extra legal support that we can provide them and the information we can provide. Again, because we have such a nationwide reach, we're able to see what kinds of things are bubbling up, what new ways and tactics that the election deniers are starting to develop in order to upset the overseeing of the elections. This is all about, and it's a very concerted effort, all about trying to undermine the public's confidence in our electoral system. And once people lose that confidence, then the election deniers can get laws passed that will allow them to determine the outcome. And in fact, you have some states already that have passed laws that basically say, if anyone in the legislature determines there's been anything that they think was untoward in an election, they can challenge it, and then they can determine who gets, for in a presidential election, who gets the electoral votes. And that's just wrong.
Governor, how did we get here? You know, in 1960, President Nixon, then Vice President Nixon, lost a very, very close election. Obviously, we remember Al Gore losing a very tight election to George W. Bush, whose administration you were a part of. How did we get here to the point that now your career, as illustrative as it's been, is now involved in handling election deniers? How did we get to this place?
Well, unfortunately, we got there. We have to look in the mirror, because for a long time, we haven't taught civics, and a lot of people have forgotten the importance of the vote. And in fact, that we're the ones who control the power if we use it. And so you had average voter turnout in primaries up until recently, and it's really keeps going back to this. It was 10%. When you only have 10% of eligible voters voting in a primary, those are your most partisan people. So they tend to be either single issue or on the extremes. So then you've got candidates that were that way. And then it became more and more dysfunctional in the Congress. So what happened then was people got, besides the fact of getting frustrated and not voting, 34% was the average turnout when Congress was the top of the ticket, and we barely make it over 52% for presidential, which is really pathetic when you think about it, particularly when you look at what happens around the world when people finally get the ability to choose their own leaders. And so we got to this point where everything is so partisan, and of course redistricting has a lot to do with that. Things are so partisan that people don't work together. And so the public in general felt they were being ignored. Their major issues were not being addressed, that all they could see was partisan bickering and trying to one up one another. And they were mad and frustrated. And so they turned to someone who reflected in language what they'd been feeling, and decided they wanted a real disruptor. And they got one in Donald Trump. And unfortunately, he was more than just a disruptor. He's been undermining our democracy now for quite some time, and unfortunately with a great deal of influence and impact.
Well, certainly one of the responses that you've taken personally has been to help found a third party. In a recent Washington Post op-ed, you explained that while most third parties fail, you don't think yours will. Why will the Forward Party not suffer the same fate of other third parties we've seen in American political history? Why don't you share a little bit about what your hopes are for the organization and what you anticipate the party doing?
Absolutely. Forward is actually more of a movement, as much a movement as it is a party. Yes, we're looking to get on the ballot and recognized as a party in 15 states this year, on the ballot in 30 next year, and 20 in 2024, 2025, all 50 of them. But the reason we're different is because we're not a traditional party. We will support Republicans, Democrats, Independents, as long as they agree with the things that we lay out as being important, which is thriving communities, the ability of people, everybody, to earn a living, and a living that allows them to live the way they want to live, security at home and abroad, respect for the rule of law and democracy. And the only two really I would say positions that we ask people to take who take the Forward, will take the Forward nomination, are ranked choice for they will support and drop a bill or support a bill for ranked choice voting in open primaries, because we have to change the system of elections if we're really going to change the representatives. And we just, at the beginning of this week, we announced our support of 3 senatorial candidates, and they're a perfect example of how we are looking at this. We have Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Republican. We have Mark Kelly, a Democrat from Arizona. And then we have Evan McMullin, an independent in Utah. We will support those people. And that's how we're active, because we're not a party yet in most states, listed as a party, recognized as a party. We've released a list of congressional candidates that we're supporting as well, and we're going to be releasing more. But also, we are going down to the local races as well. There are 500,000 elective offices across this country, and in 2020, 70% of those were uncontested. We think that's just wrong. That's where we want to have a forward candidate. And the other place we'll put a forward candidate is where you have two extremes running against one another. But if you have someone who's on the extreme fringe of either party and someone who will agree with what we think is important, we'll stay out of the race. We have no desire to be a spoiler, so-called spoiler. And we're not really looking at the presidential. I don't think we're going to be playing in that. That's going to be for other people to deal with. I mean, if it's two extremes, then obviously if we have somebody good, we would certainly consider it. But you have No Labels that is working very directly just on that and getting themselves on the ballot just for the presidential in 2024. They'll disband after that, and they'll only be there apparently if they think it's two extreme candidates. Well, that remains to be seen. But really, our focus is on building it from the ground up. We have leaders in every state, and then we have members from every state in the nation. We have leaders who are actively participating in 47 of those states who are organizing in those states and are starting to develop and get petitions signed and to get us on the ballot and recognized as a party. And we just had, it was, I guess, 3 weeks ago, we had a meeting, as it were, in Texas, in Houston. And our people from Texas were there. And I want to tell you, the atmosphere was amazing. It was so palatable how anxious people were to be part of something different and something that offered people another way, not a part of the duopoly, not either Republican or Democrat, but someone who stood up for them. And it was older people, younger people, some people who knew a lot and were already involved and organizing, and others who were there because saying, I want to learn about this. I heard about it and I want to learn about it. And even at the end of the day, those people were signing up to work and to help. And I did get asked the question there, well, if you're a forward party candidate and you're asked about gun control, let's say, what do you say? My response is you say what you believe and what your constituents want. We're not going to be the kind of party that has a platform that dictates what you have to think and where you have to stand on every issue. That has got to be representative of the locals, your local constituency. We're looking to have a convention in next June, and we will have a platform, but it will be more of a platform of principles than it will be on specific issues other than ranked choice voting and open primaries.
Well, that's you're warming my heart as a professor of political science, because at Eagleton, we really have long cared for local politics and have tried very hard to get students and our colleagues in the discipline to care about local politics for the reasons I think you've outlined. So, appreciate that more than a plug, but your direction in that way. Could you share? So, part of your banner for Forward is not left, not right, forward. I think you've articulated a little bit about that, but if you could just share why those divisions or those titles are not something you want to hold to. What does Forward mean?
Forward means people coming together to solve the issues rather than trying to make political points. As we know now, frankly, almost every issue in Washington is looked at through the partisan political prism rather than the policy prism. I mean, imagine what it would be like if we had more Lisa Murkowski's, Mark Kelly's, and Evan McMullins in the Senate, people who will work. And that's the other thing that they do have to say is they'll work across the aisle, but they commit to doing that, our candidates. And when we have people like that, you can actually get things done. You can still be a Democrat, you can still be a Republican, you can still be an independent, and yet claim the Forward label. And that's what makes us so different, because I think part of the problem in previous third parties is they've either been about one man, and it's always been a man, or they've been about a single issue or a single set of issues like the Green Party. And they haven't been broad enough to really attract enough of the voting public to make them viable. We are about whatever the issues are that are important to your locality, because what's important to Newark is going to be very different than what's important to Salt Lake City. I mean, it just, and we should recognize that and celebrate that. But that doesn't mean that you then can't send to Washington candidates and people who will listen to their constituents, but still come together and work out issues, because that's what used to happen. I mean, as you well know, as a political science professor, there used to be pretty volatile and volatile debates on the floor of the House or the well of the Senate. But then they went out afterwards and had a drink together and said, okay, we got a problem we got to solve. And they'd come up with answers. And we're lacking that now. And we've been told that we have to hate one another. If you disagree with me on an issue, I've got to hate you. You've got to be my enemy. And yet, interestingly enough, and I'm sure you've seen this, every poll says that, in fact, when you sit people down from the opposite sides and talk about an issue, we're really in the same place. Everybody wants pretty much the same thing. We may have a slightly different way about going, how do we go about to achieve it? But we're not so divided when you get to the issues themselves. We're just being told we are from a partisan perspective.
Well, there's no question about it. We understand that the culture war oftentimes is more in Washington than in the nation. And of course, it gets preyed upon, however, through Washington more times than not. Maybe that's a podcast for another day. I want to talk a little bit about you're an iconic figure. I don't mean to patronize you. You have been not only the only woman governor in New Jersey's history, but a real voice for, I guess we can say, as you've outlined, centrism, a kind of a return to moderation in our politics, avoiding the extremes. But, as a woman in New Jersey politics and now national politics, having served in Washington, where do you see the nation going with respect to women in politics? Have you been encouraged since you've left office? Or do you think, maybe we've got much more work to do than you would have anticipated? I'm curious about that, given your career and what you've stood for.
Well, we still have more work to do. There are more women now in Congress than there have been in the past. There are a lot of women who are running for office now at all the various levels, which is a good thing, but still not as many as we need. And very often you see that they get the nomination in districts that are considered, it's hopeless. We'll put a woman up to show that we support women, but we know she's not going to win, so it's not going to be a problem. And that's still an issue, I believe. I mean, that's certainly what happened to me when I ran for the Senate in 1990 against Bill Bradley. I mean, I got the nomination because they needed a sacrificial lamb. Fortunately, I did well enough that wasn't the outcome, but it had been for the woman who they put up against him the first time he ran for re-election. So we still have more of that, but overall, I think we are doing better than we have in the past, but still not well enough, because there's no one group that has all the right answers. We need more women and we need more minorities. We need people from different walks of life with different life experiences to come together to be the ones who can actually come up with solutions that will stand the test of time. We need that diversity. We need to understand that that's not threatening. That's good for us. That's what will give us the path forward, I believe. And so I still don't think there are enough certainly not of minorities or of women for that matter.
Is that something you're attentive to in forward? Is that a part of your objective as well?
Well, we certainly are attentive to it and who we are and who we make up. We're constantly checking ourselves and trying to make a greater effort to get more people of color and more women. We're pretty heavily women right now in the structure, in the organizational structure, because that's important in reaching out to people in the communities. And we're very focused on that as in our outreach as well. That we're talking about all the communities, all the people, not just some group of people. I mean, New Jersey, I always used to call it the one state, many families, one state, many faces, one state. And it was because, or many faces, one family. I'll get it right eventually. As many faces, one family, because that's who we are. And that gives us our texture and our depth and the way we've been successful, because we have so many people from so many different walks of life that have had a role to play in our government structure, that I think it's been enormously helpful for us. It's only positive.
Well, today is an interesting day. The day we're recording this, we're hearing all kinds of news out of Washington, and I don't need to go into the details. People will probably hear about subpoenas of the former president from Congress and information about the January 6th assault on the nation's capital. And yet here you are, as impassioned as I've ever heard you. Since I moved to New Jersey years ago, began working, you sound as impassioned today as you did then. What keeps you going? Why do you seem to have so much hope when so many are despairing?
Well, because I have to have hope, because I'm deeply troubled about our democracy and for our democracy. I mean, democracy, our form of government doesn't ask a lot of us, but it does ask us to be informed and to vote. And watching what's happening, the lies that are spreading, and constantly there's somehow this feeling that there aren't facts, that you can have your own facts, you can make up your own facts, that you won't listen to the other side at all. And the undermining of the public's confidence in our electoral system is terrifying, frankly, for the future of democracy. But within both of those, each of the groups, both Forward and States United, there are dedicated people who are absolutely committed to working together to figure this one out and to protect our democracy. And they give me a lot of hope. And they remind me how many good and solid people there are in the country. And for the first time in our history, don't forget, we are, depending on which poll you look at, we're close to 50% of registered voters are registered independent. That's never happened before. And you have over 60% of the American people in general, Republicans and Democrats, who said they'd welcome a third alternative. They'd like to see a third alternative. So that's where we are as a country. I've always believed that. We're more in the center. We're not red and we're not blue, we're purple. And that's the kind of people we are, which is what's great about the United States. And I want to see that have a voice, that purple group have a voice that they haven't had in the past, recent past anyway.
Certainly. Well, Governor Whitman, I don't want to extend this any further. That is a truly hopeful and powerful note, I think, to conclude this conversation. We hope you join us again in the future to talk more about Forward.
But I want to tell people, go to forward.com or to go to States United democracycenter.org and take a look at what we're doing. Actually, we're just putting out a book. Well, the University of Pennsylvania is putting out a book that we did because we're getting the Brown Medal the award next week, and they have put together a book for that. So that outlines, it's all factual, it's just facts, but it outlines what the dangers are and what some of the solutions are.
The Eagleton Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan research unit of Rutgers University. This moment in democracy was made possible in part by the generosity of Gerald and Kiko Harvey and Eagleton's many supporters. To support our work or sign up for our email newsletter, click the links in the description. To learn more about the Institute, visit eagleton.rutgers.edu and follow us on social media.